So in this section, we're going to be taking a look at political economy, and we're going to be focusing on the institutions that give rise to this interesting connection of politics and economics. And it's really important to note right at the outset that politics and economics are intrinsically linked, right? The nature of the economy is often one of the largest points of contention in any particular political system. And conversely, economic systems are based in large parts on the political systems in which they exist. And so the study of the relationship between economics and politics is unsurprisingly called political economy. And this study of the interaction of politics and economics is a huge subsection inside of both not only comparative politics, but also macroeconomics and economics more generally. And so we're going to see that there's lots of economists who come over and study political phenomena, and there's going to be a lot of political scientists who will move over and study economic phenomena. And what we need to remember, and what we're going to try to get around, is to recognize that it's base level, that there shouldn't be a big surprise, because excuse me, politics is the study of power, and economics is the study of the creation and distribution of wealth. And so there's obviously going to be an overlap here. As a matter of fact, Robert Gilpin is going to say, quote, "The distinction between economics as the science of wealth and politics as the science of power is essentially an analytic one. In the real world, wealth and power are ultimately joined. This, in fact, is the basic rationale for a political economy." And what he's basically saying is that when we study things, we have set aside the study of power and the study of wealth, not because necessarily they're intrinsically different. As a matter of fact, he's arguing that they aren't, but rather they're just different ways of looking at very common things. And so this is why he's going to argue that political economy is something very important for us to understand when we want to understand things like human development, wealth, and inequality. But there's going to be some key concepts that we're going to need to be focusing on and thinking about in this section. We're going to be talking about markets, this aggregation of buying behavior, property, the ability and the extent to which individuals own things, and public goods, which are very difficult to divide and diffuse to all things that come to a number of people that might not be able to exist potentially in a market. So what is then a market? Let's start there and then we'll move forward. Because the beginning of any discussion of a political economy begins with an understanding of the natures of markets and property. And the concept of a market often makes people think of a geographic location, right? You're thinking of the grocery market or this big fair where people are selling all of these things. But really, those are just kind of constructions. Really, a market is just the aggregation of individual buying behavior. Or more simply put, if you're an economist, the market is simply the natural forces of supply and demand at work, right? So this can become difficult when you hear about things like the market decisions or the market trends, because markets are actually just a natural process which operate constantly, not due to any other reason than it seems to be the natural way for people to interact. So if the market is deciding something, what that really means is lots of people are buying and selling something in a certain way. So as people want to buy and sell, the forces of supply and demand act upon them. So these decisions are not some top-down force, but rather they're the result of millions of individuals making decisions about what to buy and what not to buy. So an example about this one might help. So assume I produce a laptop, like all other laptops, but I sell them today for $10,000 a piece. We all know that I'd quickly go out of business. Why? Because I'm charging more than what the average person is willing to buy for this, because this is much more expensive than what other people are producing it for. So the quote market unquote price is merely what people are willing or not willing to pay and thereby clear the market, or what sellers can or cannot afford to sell and thereby clear the market. Markets are spontaneously emerging institutions wherever people interact, and they're interacting and trading. Now the second concept that we need to take a look at is property. And property is a huge part of understanding a market. Now, property refers to the ownership of something, of goods and services. So that means if I own property, I have a good or a service that belongs to me. Property is land, building, personal items, the ability to do something. And so a property right means that individuals who own property can decide what to do with that property without interference from others. So a property right means I can do something with something that's mine without you being able to tell me what to do. So a property assumes that the mark of X is belonging to me is that I can do with it what I will without interference from anyone else, no matter what that X is. Now, not all states will either totally or even equally recognize property and the property rights that come along with them. They may not allow people to own anything. They may allow them to only own certain things. There may be some certain things we decide that individuals can own, and these are each going to result in unique political economies. Now, if you don't want people owning something, one potential reason is this third concept that we need to talk about, which is a public good. Public goods either cannot be or are not allowed to be owned by individuals, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And some of the oftentimes used examples of this are going to be military, defense, roads. And most all states are going to provide some forms of public goods, meaning objects over which the state will hold a monopoly either because it does not want to or believes the market will not produce the best desired outcome. And so this means that we're going to have to think about things like social expenditures when we talk about political economies, because public goods cost things, and costing things comes from taxes. So military, roads, education, whatever the desired outcome of the public good might be, these cost funds, and these are considered social expenditures. So this means we're also going to have to understand a little bit about money and taxes. States fund their activities through taxes, and there's a variety of ways to tax, but any tax is sometime that a state collects a rent on an activity. So an example might be, and this is a real one, when you buy something, you pay a tax. A sales tax is a rent on purchasing. When you save something, when you move, when you register or license something, when you live in a certain area, right? Your property taxes, when you build a building, the permits, the list is long of the number of things on which the state might collect a rent. Now, taxes also, not only do they affect public goods, because that's the money from which those things come, but they're also going to affect markets because they can change the supply and demand calculus. So imagine if you're purchasing a $15,000 car, it's going to cost you about a 15% sales tax. Or if it were to cost you a 2.2 sales tax, in a 15% sales tax state, fewer cars are going to be sold than in a 2.2 tax environment. So besides just increasing or decreasing the amount of money you have for public goods, taxes will also affect markets and market decision making. They're also going to have a variety of other potential effects because states have the ability to increase, decrease, and deal with the economy. And so there's a variety of things that might happen in a political economy as the result of state market interference. One is inflation, one is hyperinflation, and one is deflation. Inflation is when there's an increase in the overall prices in an economy. So in other words, your dollars are purchasing less today than they were yesterday, and they'll purchase less tomorrow than they will today. And so this can result in an increase in the amount of money in an economic system. One of the big reasons this happens quickly is often due to government printing more money, but it's also possibly due to when demand can outstrip supply in just even a pure market. Now, hyperinflation is what economists have identified as inflation that's higher than 50% per month for more than 2 months in a consecutive row. Now, this means that it would take 50% more of your currency in 2 months, or 1 month, to purchase what that amount of money purchases today. Now, to compare hyperinflation, when we start talking about this in the context of states, Keep in mind that the average range of inflation in North America, meaning the United States, Canada, etc., is going to range anywhere between 1 to 4%, right? So, big difference. The other thing to keep in mind is deflation, and this is when prices drop rapidly, and this happened during the Great Depression in food, and we'll talk about how that can have an impact in a minute. Now, there are other kinds of regulations and tax issues that can arise that impact political economic systems. Tariffs, quotas, non-tariff barriers, and all of these are going to be regulations and taxes that deal primarily with the goods coming in and out of a country. And so as these are typically lower, imports are going to rise, and as these are higher, imports are typically going to fall. Now, what are each of these? Tariffs. Tariffs are going to be taxes imposed in addition on goods coming into a country. So if a good comes into the United States, a tariff would be an additional tax on that. For instance, we have sugar taxes in the United States. A quota is a total number of how many of some good you're going to let something come into the country. Now, a quota is, like we were saying, sorry about the interruption, a quota is when a country is only going to let in X amount of money or X amount of goods totally. So if you're going to let in cars, you're only going to let 100 cars and no more than 100. A non-tariff barrier is going to be a barrier where you're preventing or taxing a good, but you're not doing it with a tariff. So for instance, a subsidy to farmers would be a non-tariff barrier to someone who's importing food into the United States. Now there's going to be a number of theories of political economy that we're going to take a look at and that we need to be familiar with. Oops, too far. And these are going to be liberalism, mercantilism, communism, and social democracy. And we're going to look at each of these individually, because each of these is a different way of thinking about how politics and economy should work together, different ways of thinking about how extensive or not extensive a market should be, or how extensive or not extensive things like tariffs and non-tariff barriers should be. And so we'll look at each of these in turn, and we're going to begin with liberalism. Now, liberalism is best expressed in North America by conservatism or libertarianism. And this is something to keep in mind when you're thinking about comparative politics. And we talked about this when we're going to talk about political ideologies as well. The names are not always going to match up with what you're expecting here in the United States. Okay? So just remember that. Liberalism is going to argue that weak states are the best states. Liberals believe that markets, pure markets, produce better outcomes than states can produce through rents and public goods. And in the case of potentially an anarchist, they're going to even argue that state intervention at all is completely unjustifiably morally. So they're going to argue that markets and property at the minimum should be regulated little to encourage competition and innovation in order to produce a free market system of production based on private ownership and open markets. And so the central tenet for economic liberalism is a political policy of what's called laissez-faire, which means that government should not intervene in the economy. So laissez-faire means that the government should not intervene in the economy. One of the key thinkers in this vein is a guy called Adam Smith, and he's going to argue in 1755 that, quote, little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence, meaning riches, from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, meaning low taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural course of things. And so liberalism basically says if you just let people do what they will in a market system, they're going to produce the best outcomes possible, and this is what you should want. And so liberalism emphasizes the importance of individual freedom over all else, and we're going to see that in the United States and the United Kingdom, this is still a dominant frame. The second one we're going to take a look at is social democracy, and it's really a combination of liberalism and communism. Socialism draws on these two traditions, and it's going to accept private property, but it is not going to allow individuals to use their property however they want, nor do they want markets that are completely unhindered like the liberal. According to the Social Democrats, it is necessary to preserve, the state is necessary to preserve collective equality within a semi-free market. So people can't be allowed to be too rich or too poor. There's a focus here on equality. And so there's going to be private property within limits. So the state is not an overall threat to the social democrat. It's a means by which to assure that markets don't run amok and they don't lead to gross inequality. And in the US, this is most closely be aligned with the Democratic Party. The third big political economy type that we're going to take a look at is communism. Communism is a system which wants and does away with all private property and conversely individual freedom in order to create a complete equality among individuals. So the central tenet for communism is absolute inequality. So where a social democrat just doesn't want there to be excesses of poor and rich, a communist wants complete equality. The thinker Karl Marx is going to be the theorist who's going to develop the system of communism, arguing that private property and free markets cannot truly serve the needs of society as a whole, and that all property at some stage in development should be held by the state for the good of society. Now, Marx thought that this process was inevitable. He's a determinist, and that the state will naturally take on these roles. And so what this means is that slowly the state in communism will nationalize, meaning it'll gain control of more and more industries. The final political economic system that we're going to take a look at is mercantilism. Mercantilism, which is a very dominant form, it's making a resurgence often in the form of neo-mercantilism, argues that the needs of the state are paramount to all other needs, and that the domestic economy itself is simply an instrument that exists to serve the needs of the state by generating wealth that can be used for national power. Mercantilism is very popular in most European economies up until about a century ago. But more recently, this contemporary neo-mercantilism has become very strong, and you can see it in a variety of parties around the world. Because what mercantilists are going to argue, look, it doesn't matter who owns things, private ownership, state ownership, whatever. The goal is to increase wealth, increase and empower the wealth of the state. And so internationally, mercantilists want to suck money and suck power into their state and not let it seep out, is the way they're going to see it. And so they're going to be in favor of very high tariffs and trade barriers because they don't want to lose wealth to other states. And you're going to hear kind of neo-mercantilism and people worried about trade imbalances and things like that. So these are the big positions. This is kind of our groundwork for thinking about political economy as we move forward, and let's stop here for this lecture.